Thanks for joining today. I'm Alex Rich. I'm a data science manager at Flatiron Health, and I'll be sharing some of our work on extracting clinical events and their dates to generate real-world evidence. So I'll start with a kind of bird's eye view of why this matters and what it can unlock, jump into one specific kind of event that we'll focus on and the challenges of extracting it, and then walk through our approach and how it performs before zooming back out at the end. So there's a lot of uses of NLP for healthcare, but in this talk, I'll be focusing on its power to structure real-world data and enable the creation of real-world evidence. So real-world data are just data relating to patient status or delivery of healthcare that's routinely collected in the course of care, while real-world evidence is the understanding and insight that can then be derived from analysis of real-world data. So at Flatiron, we're focused on generating real-world evidence for oncology from electronic health record data across the Flatiron Research Network, which is a US-wide network of academic and community sites covering about 3 million patients with cancer. Real-world evidence can be used to answer all sorts of questions about cancer treatment and outcomes outside of the very narrow band of care that occurs within clinical trials. So clinical trials are a really amazing way to learn, but they can be slow, very expensive, and cohorts of interest can be too rare to enroll enough patients. And some questions just aren't really appropriately answered by trials. So real-world evidence can be used to understand current standards of care, which is a really important step for trial design. It can compare treatment effectiveness across different drugs in the real world to inform guidelines and payer reimbursement decisions. And it can also be used, as I mentioned, to study rare populations, to identify disparities of care among racial, ethnic, or other groups, to measure safety and effectiveness of off-label treatments, and quite a bit more. So how do we prepare EHR data so it's ready to use to produce real-world evidence? Well, some variables already exist in a structured form in the EHR, so things like demographics, lab results, ICD codes, and these variables are relatively easy to harmonize and to anonymize so that they can be used for downstream research. But a lot of other variables, including many of those that are most critical for clinical research, are really not captured in a consistent and accurate way in a structured form. So instead, they're typed in by physicians in visit notes or might be scanned in as pathology or radiology reports. So this includes things like disease histology and stage, initial diagnosis date of the disease, as well as potential later advanced or metastatic diagnosis dates, information about oral drug treatments, genomic testing results, etc. So if we want to produce real-world evidence from the EHR, we really need to be able to extract and structure this data, and clinical NLP is a tool that lets us do this at scale. So for nearly all of these variables, dates are really essential. We need to know when something happened and in what order things happened as much as we need to know what happened. So for example, a couple of really common and important analyses in cancer research are overall survival and progression-free survival, which basically measure how long a patient survives or how long their disease doesn't progress, measured from some index date such as diagnosis or start of treatment. So I'm going to focus on some work that we've been doing at Flatiron to extract clinical events and their dates from clinical text. And I'm going to focus on one example variable, which is advanced non-small cell lung cancer diagnosis. But I'll touch on how this approach expands to other clinical variables as well. So before diving into the details, I just want to zoom out again for just a minute to look broadly at kind of what ML-extracted clinical dates can unlock. So at Flatiron, we think a lot about not just real-world evidence from the EHR, but about integrated evidence. So that involves combining multiple modalities of evidence like EHR data, genomic data, and clinical trials data to answer questions that can't be addressed without this holistic view of patients and of their treatments and outcomes. So when we scale up our ability to extract information from the EHR using machine learning, we're fitting in kind of a piece of this puzzle that allows the healthcare system to integrate and learn more effectively from these other modalities as well. All right, so let's dive into looking at our target variable. So non-small cell lung cancer, or NSCLC, is the most common type of lung cancer, and it's actually the leading cause of cancer deaths in the US, although fortunately, deaths and cases are dropping due to reductions in smoking. So because of this, it's a really major target for research in cancer treatments and outcomes. Advanced NSCLC is NSCLC that has metastasized, has progressed or recurred since initial diagnosis, or that's spread extensively through the lungs and surrounding tissue. So a patient can come to have advanced cancer through several different routes, but the key is that the disease has reached a point where local treatments with a curative intent, such as surgery or radiation, are really no longer an option, and treatment requires systemic therapies such as chemotherapy or radiation. I'm sorry, chemotherapy or immunotherapy. So because advanced diagnosis marks the point where systemic therapies become this primary route for treating the disease, advanced diagnosis date is sort of a key index date for a lot of analyses. So extracting whether a patient has advanced NSCLC and the diagnosis date, if so, is a pretty challenging task even for a clinical expert for a few reasons. So first, there's a really huge volume of text. Um, a typical patient's chart contains dozens of documents, so that includes typed clinic notes, as well as radiology reports, pathology reports, and other document types that might have been scanned or faxed into the EHR. On top of that, advanced diagnosis data is also a very nuanced concept. So there's variability in the description and in what different clinicians will consider to be advanced disease. And particularly disease that's advanced from the point of diagnosis tends to be documented kind of differently from disease that becomes advanced through recurrence or progression. There's also a lot of really rare edge cases here. So things like multiple primaries, where a patient might develop two different lung cancers at different times, but without the second actually being a recurrence of the first. And reaching a conclusion about advanced diagnosis date can also involve integrating context across time and across multiple different documents. So information from a pathology or radiology report might have to be combined with a later physician confirmation in a clinic note. And information about the patient's cancer can actually evolve from the perspective of the clinician. So spots on spots on the bones in a radiology scan can make a clinician believe that the patient has metastatic cancer, but a later biopsy might show that those spots were benign. On the other hand, cancer that appeared local at first might be discovered to be metastatic during surgery. So given this complexity, there's really two keys to being able to accurately find advanced NSCLC diagnosis date with NLP. So the first is having a large volume of labels from clinical experts who are performing chart review, also called abstraction, that we can use to capture the diversity and complexity of the disease and of its documentation. And the second is a machine learning approach that can effectively learn from these labels and integrate information and synthesize conflicting pieces of information. So at Flatiron, we're pretty well positioned to approach this problem because we have a large volume of labels from our expert abstraction team. So let's get into the details now of how our machine learning approach works. So we take an end-to-end modeling approach to the problem. We start with a set of documents associated with a patient, and then we perform text pre-processing, a pass through a deep learning model, some post-processing, and ultimately are going to output two values. So these two values are a probability that the patient has advanced NSCLC, which we can then binarize as true or false, and then a diagnosis date for when they receive their advanced diagnosis, if they do have advanced disease. So we start with the documents. Each document will have a category and a metadata date. So here we have a fictitious clinic note from 2018. And then we have the document content. We can see that at the start of this note, the physician is describing the patient and his disease, some genetic testing information, past chemo and radiation treatments, all in this very information-heavy technical way. And as I mentioned, patients might have quite a few of these notes, along with other document types. So a really necessary first step is to try to filter out this irrelevant information. So to do this, we work with the clinical experts at Flatiron to curate a list of search terms and regular expressions that encompass terms that might be used in association with advanced NSCLC. So this includes some pretty general terms like advanced, metastatic, or relapsed, and also some more disease-specific ones like mediastinal. So using these terms, we select sentences in the chart that include one or more of the terms, and then ignore the remainder of the text. And given that physicians often don't use standard punctuation, we invested in building some custom logic to ensure that we're generally getting the start and end of sentences right, at least most of the time. So once we've done this extraction, we can form a kind of timeline of sentences that might be related to a patient's diagnosis over time, where each sentence is associated with the timestamp of the document from which it was taken. But we might see that some sentences explicitly mention a date. So this sentence here on the right was written in March 2018, but it's actually referring to an event from 2017. So to capture this, we actually find and parse dates that are mentioned within the extracted sentences. And then we reassign these sentences to have a timestamp that matches the date referred to within the sentence. So we now take these dated sentences, we tokenize them and convert them to numeric indexes using pretty standard methods. And then we convert the paired dates into integers relative to some standard index date so that they're also in a numeric format that will be easier for the model to process. So now we have input data for the model. We need to think about, what should this model be outputting? So at first glance, predicting a date might seem like a natural fit for a regression problem since dates are, roughly continuous. But this prediction problem doesn't really behave much like a normal regression problem. There aren't really particular words or phrases that tend to indicate earlier or later diagnosis. And the two most likely diagnosis dates for a patient might not really be anywhere close to each other, but might be two different pieces of documentation that are months apart with very little chance that the diagnosis date is anywhere in the middle. So given these characteristics, we actually structure our model as a sequence prediction problem over a series of query dates, which is basically all of the dates where we want the model to make a prediction. We'll input the list of query dates to the model along with the tokenized sentences and their dates. And for each query, we'll ask the model to output 3 predicted probabilities. We'll ask it to output the probability that the query is more than 30 days before the diagnosis, the probability that it is within 30 days of the diagnosis, and the probability that it is more than 30 days after the diagnosis. To choose the query dates, we'll use any date that's within 30 days of at least one sentence date and input those all into the model. So at the end of the modeling process, when we get these probabilities out, we then will have a process to roll that up to produce our final date prediction, which we'll cover soon. So I'll note that there are different ways we could have formatted this output. So for example, just having before and after probabilities. But we found that having these 3 categories seems to help for a more stable and performant training process. So now let's get into the forward pass of the model and kind of what's happening to each of these sentences. So for each sentence, we're going to pass it through a word embedding and then a bidirectional GRU layer similar to an LSTM to produce a output hidden state for each word. And from there, we apply a simple attention layer that results in a weighted sum of these hidden states. And then finally, another linear layer that's going to project that down to a smaller vector. So what we're left with is a single dense vector for each sentence that represents the information found in that sentence. So now we have sentence vectors and associated dates, and we want to turn this into a prediction at each query date. So we need a mechanism to integrate all this information about the past, present, and future relative to a query, and then output a set of probabilities for that query. Well, so first, sorry, let me pause for a second at the beginning of this slide. Okay, so we now have sentence vectors and their associated dates, which we want to turn into predictions for each query date. So we need a mechanism to integrate information from the past, present, and future relative to that query and produce some kind of output vector for that query. So we'll do this using a temporal aggregation layer that uses principles pretty similar to the multi-headed attention layers that are used in transformer sequence-to-sequence models. So in a transformer model, the output of multi-headed attention is based on a query, key, and value vectors. And one takes the dot product between the query vectors and the key vectors to determine sort of how much of each of the value vectors is passed through into the output. Now in our model, the query dates and sentence dates take the place of those query and key vectors, and it's the temporal difference between the query dates and sentence dates that determines how much of the sentence vectors, sort of how they're aggregated to produce the outputs. Ultimately, this process produces an output vector associated with each query. So from here, we pass each vector through a pair of feed-forward layers, followed by a softmax. This is going to produce our predicted probabilities for each query of whether that query is before, within 30 days of, or after the diagnosis. So once we have model outputs, we have to convert them into what we care about, which is whether and when the patient has an advanced NSCLC diagnosis. So for the binary output, we take the latest query date and then sum the probabilities that that is after or within 30 days of the diagnosis date, and then binarize that to true or false variable. And for the date, we're going to look at each query date and then take the date where that has the highest average within 30-day score for all of the queries within 30 days of that date. Now, these rollup methods are a bit complex and throw out a lot of the model output, and our team is actively researching ways to redesign the network's output structure and this rollup approach to bring them into closer alignment. All right, so now that we have walked through the whole end-to-end approach, let's see how it performs. So for the results I'll describe, we use labeled data from the EHR documents of patients in the Flatiron Health Research Network. We included patients who had lung cancer ICD codes, and we know that some, but not all of these patients are going to end up having non-small cell lung cancer specifically. So for patients within this cohort, our team of expert abstractors identified whether the patient had NSCLC and their initial and advanced diagnosis dates, if so. So while we've been mainly discussing advanced NSCLC here, I'll also share brief results for training the model on initial NSCLC diagnosis as well. And these initial and advanced diagnosis models were both trained on labels of about 39,000 patients with a separate testing data set of about 14,000 patients. So jumping into the results, we found that for advanced diagnosis, we could achieve a recall of about 0.95 and a precision of around 0.85. So we're catching nearly every advanced NSCLC patient, but we're mixing in some patients who have non-advanced NSCLC or even who have advanced forms of another lung cancer. But among patients where the model and the label agree that the patient has advanced NSCLC, we see that the diagnosis dates agree to within 30 days about 84% of the time. And when we look at our results for initial NSCLC diagnosis, we see higher performance. There's a lot less clinical subtlety in whether a patient has NSCLC than in whether the disease is advanced. And so here we have recall and precision that's up in the high 90s and a date accuracy of 90%. So returning to the advanced variable, this histogram shows the distribution of date errors binned into groups on the x-axis. So the errors are very long-tailed. We see that most dates are correct to within plus or minus 7 days, but some can be off by over a year. And this, again, is kind of reflecting this underlying structure of the problem where different progression events for the patient can be months apart, and there's really a high risk that the model can confuse which one is the advanced diagnosis date. Now, all of these preceding metrics are very informative to a data scientist, but they don't really tell a user of this real-world evidence data set whether the ML-extracted variable is fit for use. What a biostatistician or other user wants to know is, will this data set with ML-extracted diagnosis date produce accurate conclusions in my analysis? And particularly, is it going to be similar results to what I'd get from an expert human-abstracted data set? This is a pretty difficult question to answer, but this graph is kind of a start to that answer. So what we have here is a survival curve showing overall survival of patients from the time of advanced diagnosis, which is a really key endpoint for real-world evidence analyses. And so to read this graph, you'd kind of start from the top left at the time of diagnosis. And as we move across the graph, we can observe the proportion of patients who survive a given number of months with advanced disease. So there's actually two lines here. One is showing a cohort selected based on abstracted advanced NSCLC status and abstracted date, and the other showing ML extracted status and date. And we can see that despite us knowing that there's quite a few errors in the model, these curves actually end up looking nearly identical. And conclusions about overall survival are the same with abstracted and ML extracted data. Now, in practice, running an analysis with real-world evidence is going to involve a lot more than just looking at overall survival of all advanced patients. There's usually going to be a lot of nuanced inclusion criteria for the study, many more covariates in the survival analysis. So statisticians at Flatiron are building a much more extensive set of evaluations and replications of different past studies to show in what use cases ML-extracted variables do and don't currently work. And this really guides how we develop ML-based data sets. All right, so looking to the future, we continue to expand our use of NLP for extracting clinically important dates that can unlock the promise of RWE and integrated evidence. So we've already used our initial and advanced diagnosis models to extract these dates for all NSCLC patients in the Flatiron Network, which is already unlocking some preliminary research use cases. And we're now working to expand this model to a number of other important clinical dates. So we're building models for several treatment variables, including oral drug start and stop dates, surgery dates, and radiation treatment dates. And these extensions are requiring some generalizations of the model. So things like ensuring that the same model can be used to extract different drug treatments. We're also extending the architecture for multiple dates, such as disease progression, which can occur many times over the course of a patient's journey. And this is forcing us to modify how we think about those aspects of kind of rolling up the sequence predictions. And we're also working on some entirely different NLP data extraction approaches, such as ones that work well for dates that occur in highly structured reports, such as scan genomic testing reports, which often show up in the EHR system. So finally, as we build these additional variables, expanding beyond non-small cell lung cancer and into additional cancers is a really primary concern. So some treatment and testing variables are likely to generalize well across diseases, but others like histology and the definition of metastatic and advanced disease, or even whether these concepts apply in the same way, are likely to vary significantly and require a lot more customized modeling approach and partnership with clinicians. So we're really excited to see how all this work progresses over the coming years and the downstream research that it makes possible to improve the lives of patients with cancer. So thanks for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions via email or in the chat.